Welcome to Smart Talk, where we speak with leading academics and other thoughtful persons on the important challenges facing the world today. My name is Ed Dodson. I am a longtime member of the faculty of the Henry George School of Social Science. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Walter Horn, who holds a PhD in philosophy from Brown University. He is author of 3 books, the most recent titled Democratic Theory Naturalized, The Foundation of Distilled Populism, published in 2021 by Lexington Books. Additionally, he has authored many papers on epistemology, public policy, and aesthetics. Currently, he reviews books on democracy for the 316 AM magazine and maintains a blog where he writes on the nature of democracy at luckorcunning.blogspot.com. Beyond his academic work, Dr. Horn has composed and performed music you can listen to on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Music. Dr. Horn has some very interesting observations regarding what constitutes a truly democratic republic and the impact of populism on systems of law and public policy. In Democratic Theory Naturalized, he offers us a scheme for a much broader democratic structure than has ever existed in the United States. Among his recommended reforms is the elimination of the Electoral College, a reduction of the voting age to 16, and replacement of the Senate and House of Representatives with a unicameral Congress. I'm sure that in our conversation, he will explain to us why these reforms are so important and offer additional ideas to expand democracy by what he calls distilled populism. Dr. Horn, welcome to Smart Talk.
Thanks, Ed.
Well, let's get right into the central issues that are associated with your thinking about democracy. In the first pages of your book, Democratic Theory Naturalized, you write that your, quote, goal is to uncover foundations that can be used to support a number of populist arrangements, reasons why such, perhaps ideal polities, and only such polities should be considered worthy democracies. So a good place to start our conversation is to ask you to explain why democracy requires the existence of populist arrangements.
Well, the idea of populism, as I understand it, is, I just mean by it something like radical democracy. And what radical democracy is, it sounds scary, and populism sounds scarier. I know people associate it with Bolsonaro or Trump or maybe even Mussolini and Hitler. But all I mean by it is that the majority will rule, that the minority will have appropriate voice in legislatures and in government, and that the elections are absolutely fair. And we don't have any of those things currently in the US. In fact, I would say that we have never had any of those things. So while things are getting worse, they've never really been very good. We've never had a system where the majority rules, where the minority gets its say, and where all the plebiscites are fairly conducted. So that's what I mean by distilled populism. Those things.
Okay.
It shouldn't be connected with any thoughts about nativism or right wing or left wing views. It's supposed to just require self-government.
And it's important that those who read your book come to that conclusion. After my own reading of your book, it took me quite a while to really understand what you were getting at. And in the world, in our everyday world, except for someone who's been living in the wilderness for the last 30 years, I think any thoughtful person has to be deeply concerned about the deep ideological divide that threatens our basic liberties and the continuing existence of our republic, which is what you've just alluded to. What do you see as the most serious threats we face, and what ought to be done to eliminate them?
Well, I absolutely agree with you that the ideological differences, the polar animosity. Now it's very dangerous and getting worse. That's probably began with the APSA study on parties from 1960, when they wanted the parties. APSA, the American Political Science Association, decided that the party system was no good in the US because there were liberal Republicans and there were conservative Democrats, and so you couldn't tell what your party was actually for. It was the kind of foggy slop, and they didn't like that. They thought the party system should be really responsible, so they pushed for responsible, what they called a responsible party system, or and it worked. It took a long time, but now there are no more liberal Republicans, there are no more conservative Democrats, and we have a really polarized society. So I agree with that portion of the concern, but maybe I do live in the wilderness in my Boston suburbs with respect to the business about loss of individual liberties, because I think there's actually been too much focus on that in the U.S. That's not something I'm concerned with. I think that's something that gun rights activists are concerned with. Vaccine opponents are concerned with. I think in order to have democracy, there has to be some ability for governments to actually get things that the people want. And to the extent that you go too far with individual rights, you can't have a democratic system. So but on the other hand, you do have to have some individual rights. Otherwise, you can't have a democracy. You have to have equal protection. You have to have equal treatment under the law. You have to have freedom of speech. You have to have freedoms of association and assembly. So you have to have political rights. But once you get beyond those, you start getting into areas where all you're really doing is restricting democracy. And so I'm not so concerned about the loss of individual liberties as is suggested in your question.
Seems like the debate that Madison and Hamilton engaged in has been resurrected in a very strident way. I'm also thinking, as you're speaking, about what the philosopher Mortimer Adler wrote about the distinction between freedom and liberty. He wrote that liberty is freedom constrained by justice. The challenge, of course, is we cannot find a consensus agreement on what constitutes justice.
Right. I'm skeptical that any consensus can ever be reached on justice or really any other moral proposition. So what I try to do in my book is leave aside moral claims and justice claims and just look at prudential values. Leave aside moral values. What's a prudential value? That's to decide what is good for a person, not what's good, not what's morally good or what's ethically good, but what's good for a person or good for a group. And so what things are good for a group or for a person? And if you think about prudential values, think about any kind of values, aesthetic values, moral values, you have to distinguish between intrinsic values and extrinsic or instrumental values. And since I'm focusing on prudential values, the intrinsic prudential value, in my view, is just getting what one chooses. That can cause extrinsic harms, as we know. If a drug addict gets what he or she wants, it might be bad for him or her. So there can have extrinsic harms, but what makes those harmful? What makes the addict's choice harmful is that eventually that's not what he wants. He doesn't want to be addicted. He doesn't want to be, having withdrawal. He doesn't want those things. So when we look at extrinsic values or instrumental values, though they still relate to the final intrinsic values. And in prudential terms, what that is getting what one wants. And so to me, that's the key of what democracy is. So what you have to do in democratic theory is figure out first what it is that's a good. And I say it's getting what one wants, which seems obvious. Again, getting what one wants may not be good in the long run, because it may have extrinsic harms, but intrinsically, that's what democracy is about, getting what one wants. And so you have to figure out what that is. Then you have to figure out how to determine what a community wants. And so you have to figure out how to set up a system of fair voting rights. How you have to worry about campaign finance, for example. You have to worry about whether it should be approval voting or ranked choice voting. You have to think about all that kind of stuff. And then you have to think about what the government structure is like. And that's why, as you mentioned, I don't like bicameralism or indeed things with 12. Some have more than two. Some countries have more than two. All those are doing what those things are set to do, as you say, they're Madisonian ideas. They're to prevent the demos from getting what it wants. They're saying, well, let's think about it. Let's have the Senate maybe require 60 votes to do something, and you got to get it by the House too, and you got to get the president to support it too. They're all things to prevent people from getting what they want. So they're basically they call them checks and balances. They're basically anti-democratic proposals shoved in there to prevent people from getting what they want. And I don't blame Madison for that stuff so much, because he was afraid. You do need to have some protections. As I say, you need to require equal treatment. You need to require due process of law. You need to require those things. Otherwise, people get pulled out of their house and just, dispatched in the middle of the night. So I think it's understandable, but I don't think enough thought went into exactly which are the things you need to have in order to have democracy. And again, I think it's also the case that when people think about democracy, they think, well, a really nice democratic system will be kind, or a really nice democratic system will be virtuous. And I don't think democracy can provide that. Other things can, education and virtue maybe, but that's not democracy. Democracy is a system that will get people what they want. And if a group of people are cruel, you can expect that a democracy will produce a cruel country. You can't expect it to let's to also make people good. That's not its job.
Then what is the recourse for those who are adversely impacted by what the majority decides they want?
Well, it's difficult. I mean, again, we have to ensure some protections. You have to have right of free speech. They have to be able to vote for their people, the people that they want. They have to have a voice, an appropriate voice in government, which would be provided, by proportional representation. And so there are certain things majorities can't do to their minorities in a democratic country, but they can be obnoxious. And a cruel people will produce a cruel government. And what's going to fix that? Well, I don't know. Nicer people, better education, but that's not democratic theory. That's we leave that to parents and schools and so, but that's not democracy. And I think I do think that a country might decide, as the Trumpians say, to put up a wall. I think a country that's really xenophobic could well decide to do that. And you might not want to live in that country. Maybe you don't think that's a nice thing to do, to put up walls, but if that's what the people want, they should be allowed to do that. On the other hand, if people get in, if these immigrants or intended immigrants get in and they live there for a while, say a year, they should be able to vote. And if they don't like the idea of a wall, they should be able to vote to get rid of the wall. And that's what's required by democracy, that the people who are living in that jurisdiction have a say, and the appropriate say.
What about at the individual level? I mean, Madison, for one, was a great defender of meritocracy, but he believed strongly in meritocracy based on individual demonstration of competency. And so we have that as a beginning, for society to come together based on, do we feel that others are competent to participate, and what criteria ought to be put forward as a demonstration of competency? Do you have any thoughts on that issue?
I do. I am very opposed to views of that kind. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't aware that that was Madison's view, but I know that was John Stuart Mill's view, and he thought that people with certain levels of education should have additional votes. That view, it's called epistocracy. That it should be ruled by the wise, and maybe it goes back to Plato. And I am very much opposed to that. I think it confuses what democracy is about. In philosophy, they talk about, in political philosophy, some philosophers view elections as truth tracking, so that if lots of people vote for something, that it's likely to be true or good. If people want a bridge, most people want a bridge, then having a bridge is the right thing to do. Now, I agree that if most people want a bridge, having the bridge is the right thing to do, but not because there's any wisdom in that, but only because that reflects what the people want. And I don't think you can get beyond that point, because there could be so many reasons why people want a bridge or don't want a bridge. They may not want the bridge because they think bridges are ugly. They may not want the bridge because bridges are expensive and they don't want to pay for it. They may not want the bridge because they think people will get more exercise walking around there's no truth to be found in whether the bridge is the right thing or the wrong thing. All there is that the only truth that we can get to is what people want in this case. So I'm very much opposed to epistocracy. A lot of the book is about that.
Let me interrupt you for just a second. I don't want our viewers to get the wrong idea about Madison, because when he talked about meritocracy, he wasn't referring to educational level. And in fact, he thought that the people who worked the land, the farmers, were the key to the democracy of the new republic, and very much was concerned about the Hamiltonian view of certain people, certain people in society having more, power and prestige and influence based on their position, inherited wealth, or whatever it might be. So I just want to make sure that I don't misrepresent Madison.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think I agree with either Hamilton or Madison on this point. I mean, I wouldn't want power to be allocated based either on the amount of education people have, or what sort of work they do, or whether or not we happen to think they're good people, or they're rat bastards, or I don't think democracy. I think we have to just go based on the Jeffersonian view that all people are equal and they have to be treated equally, or there isn't going to be democracy. There'll be some form of despotism. So I guess I wouldn't stand with either Hamilton or Madison on that.
So although some people might not be able to perform their civic responsibilities because of a incompetency, whether or not that was a incompetency from birth or a voluntary incompetency, someone who becomes an alcoholic or drug addict, etc. You would not preclude them from participating?
I would not preclude them. Yeah, I think it's important that felons get the vote. I think everyone should be allowed to vote. So long, the only competency that I think they need is they have to understand what a vote is. That is, they got to understand what it is they're doing. They're going to the voting because they want this or they don't want. Would you rather have the bridge or not have it? Would you rather have Jones be your president or Smith be your president? If they can understand that, they should be entitled to vote, and there should be no other competency testing. I put the age at 16 because I think that's at the point where there's a big jump, roughly, somewhere in the mid-teens. There's a big jump in that level of competency. But the idea that, well, you should be paying taxes in order to vote, or you couldn't be a bad person, and get to vote, or you should have a certain amount of, as the states had, lots of the states had, you have to have a property requirement, or you have to be a farmer in order to vote. I don't think any of those are consistent with democracy.
Is publicly funded education required to achieve the result that you're suggesting we need?
No.
No.
No, for the reasons I said. I don't think any level of education is required. Now, when you say the results that we need, if you are talking about the results that I would like, yes, I'm in favor of public education. I'm in favor of, I'm in favor of land value taxes, for example. But and so I would push for those. But I think if I were to require them, whether or not people wanted them, then that would be a kind of despotism. So yeah, I'm in favor of them. I have my views, just like everybody else, about politics, but they don't trump. I'm sorry, no pun intended there. They don't trump democratic theory. Democracy is about self-government. It's about people being able to get what they want. The fact that I want this, I want public education, or I want the land value tax, or I want the universal basic income, or whatever I want, and I could be wrong about any of this stuff. But the fact that I want those, it's interesting, and I'll push for them, and I'll give my little bit of money to those causes. But I can't require that. I can't insist that we have that, even if most people don't want it. I have to move then, maybe someplace else that will take me.
So if a majority of the individuals eligible to vote for whatever measure it might be, in particular, I'm thinking about in the introduction, your desire to have the electoral college eliminated. Right now, that would require a constitutional amendment.
Sure.
Am I correct that you would mandate that if 51% of the population of the United States voted to eliminate the electoral college would be gone?
I would if I could, yes.
Okay.
I think the people should get what they want. And in fact, it's interesting. As you know, the U.S. Constitution is really, really hard to amend. It's
yes.
In some manners, it's absolutely impossible to amend. The business about the Senate only having 2 per state, you probably need every state to agree to change that. So it's basically unamendable. But some things you can amend. And I think and of course, I would like it to be much easier to amend the U.S. Constitution. It's extremely difficult. But on the other hand, I would have things in there that were absolutely unamendable. So as you say, if 51% of the people want something, I don't think you should be able to amend the Constitution so it's not a democratic site. Those things, you have to start somewhere. And in my view, democracy is the bedrock. Otherwise, we don't have self-government. So I would make up, there are a few items, the ones that I mentioned earlier, about fairness and getting, figuring out, getting minority voice, getting majority rule, Uh, and some of those things are inconsistent with electoral colleges and, this federalism of the kind that we have in the U.S. I wouldn't make those amendable at all. So I want democracy, but not in the matter of eliminating democracy. Then there's no point. So there are some items that I would make not. I take it we could amend the Constitution so that women can't vote anymore, or that blacks can't vote anymore. That the Constitution is so amendable. I mean, to me, that's just disgusting. So I want a much more easily amendable Constitution, but I would like to have a certain batch of things in there that are just beyond reach.
Democracy, as practiced, could yield unjust outcomes.
Absolutely.
And the people would have to be wise enough to realize that those outcomes are unjust and reverse the course of history.
Yeah, you can hope. I mean, justice is such a difficult issue. Moral claims are so difficult. My own view, if I can get into it for a minute, I only discuss it a little
Please
bit.
do.
My own view is that there are some people don't think there's any morality. There's no moral truths. They're so-called error theorists. They think the whole thing is nonsense and there's no morality. I don't agree with that. I think there are moral truths. And some people think there's no evidence at all for any moral truths, that there's, and I don't agree with them either. I think that there is evidence, and the evidence comes from feelings of empathy or revulsion, that those are evidence that some state of affairs is morally good or morally bad. However, what I don't think you can get is knowledge in the area of morality. That's because there isn't a background theory. And let me explain what I mean by that. In the case of why do I think that there's a couch in the room that I'm sitting? Well, I have the same thing. I have evidence. I think there's truths. So why do I think that there are couches, but I don't think that I can, and I think I can know that there's a couch there, but I don't think I can know that killing, that eating cows is bad or something like that. The difference is that we have a scientific theory that kind of explains, that items hit me, my eyeballs, and there's a scientific theory which has been confirmed, which grounds the evidence and the truths. Whereas in morality, there really isn't that. Some people have some theories, hedonism or utilitarianism, but there's such grave objections to those views, so that you're just left with intuitions. You're just left with, well, this seems like it's really bad. And there's no theory to ground the whole matter. So in the case of morality, I'm basically skeptical, not as to the existence of moral truths, but as to the ability of anybody to know which ones they are, just because they're, perhaps somebody will come up with a moral theory that grounds the whole system of morality. Maybe somebody has, but I haven't seen it. I don't think so. But to my way of thinking, we can have much better luck with prudential values, that is what's good for someone, than we can with moral values, what's morally good or what's just. I don't think you're going to get knowledge on that front. So again, we have your views and my views, and we may be right and we may agree. I know we agree on a lot of things. I've known you for many years, and I know we agree on certain things, but that I think is insufficient so yeah, democracy comes first in my view.
I'm reminded of what Descartes left to us, and he said, I think, therefore I am. And we, unique among the animal world, have the ability to contemplate our actions before we act. We can think in advance of what the outcome of those actions is going to be. Is that not inherently knowledge? and inherently an instinct toward a moral sense of right and wrong.
Well, I think Descartes was probably right about, I think, therefore, this cogito. I don't, in order to get to moral truths, he appealed to God. And so he has an ontological proof of the existence of God. I wouldn't go along with him there. But I'm okay with the cogito.
Well, let's go off in a little bit of a different direction now. I take it that you agree with the analysis of the political scientists who warn that the money interest, the corporate, as well as others, dictate the direction of public policy. So the question is, have we passed the point of no return, or is there still an opportunity to reverse the course of our history in favor of actual equality of influence over our socio-political arrangements and institutions?
That's a good question. I think it's not impossible, but I don't think in my lifetime we'll see a reversal, because the court is so filled with this U.S. Supreme Court is so filled with justices that agree with Citizens United, for example, and Buckley v. Vallejo. I don't see that happening. I don't see, a sensible reckoning in my lifetime. Not the way power is divvied, where the Supreme Court has so much power. Nobody can do anything. Congress can't do anything about this. You'd need a constitutional amendment or lots of new justices to overturn those. In my book, I just point to one thing which I think would have a beneficial effect, and that is one small portion of the fairness doctrine, the old fairness doctrine, which was originally put in place in 1949 and then slowly, went into desuetude over the next, 50 years. But there was one provision in there. It was called after Nicholas Zappel, who was the lawyer who wrote it for the FCC. It was called the Zappel Doctrine. And what that required was that during elections, which in the U.S. is always, I guess, if a broadcast outlet had someone other than the candidate pushing that candidacy, that all opponents would get equal time at the same cost. I think, that wasn't liked by broadcasters. They thought it was onerous, it was costly. But I think the result, and they thought it would be damaging to freedom of speech and so on. I think it would pass constitutional muster. And my sense about the campaign ads is that they're not providing any real information. Anyways, it's mostly propaganda and disinformation. So if there were to be less, and because the broadcasters would not then run ads because they didn't want to run ads for their opponents, the American people probably benefit from that. But if they did continue to run ads, you'd hear from all the parties. It wouldn't apply to ballot questions, for example, or general political discussions. But it wouldn't apply if the candidate, him or herself, were to go and talk about their candidacy. But it would apply from any group or person pushing the candidacy of one candidate. Everybody else would be entitled to equal time. And I think that would pass constitutional muster. And I think it would be beneficial, but it certainly wouldn't undo the harm that the courts have done. You ask a very good question. I doubt there is much that can be done given the present constitution of the U.S. Supreme Court.
What about the role of the media these days in at least fairness in dealing with the issues that we face as a civilization? Do you get a sense that any part of the media is doing an acceptable job in presenting factual analysis that's balanced?
Uh, I guess there are some outlets, but they may just be the ones that I tend to agree with more. Um, I think some outlets are better than others, and they tend to provide more balanced views. Um, it's interesting that when say a broadcaster, a newscaster, or something, an anchor does that, they tend to get thrown out by their by either Fox or CNN or whoever it is. They
So we're left with NPR.
yeah, right. We have NPR, and I guess that's something. How unbiased they are will how unbiased they're considered will probably depend on who you ask. Um, I am, I'm not an expert on this matter, but uh, I'm glad there's NPR, and I'm glad there's a wide variety of outlets that I can turn to, but it's hard to tell who is, who's being unbiased.
Well, we have to face the fact that our institutions are being severely challenged by the ideological divide. So when you think about the future of democracy in our country, other than the issues that we've covered already, are there any additional reforms that you think will lead us back in the right direction of a democracy based on moral majority rule?
Well, I'm just reading a book now by Rick Hasson. It's a new book. It's about having a constitutional amendment requiring the right to vote, which uh, a lot of countries have, and we don't have anything like that in the U.S. In fact, uh, based on some readings of the Constitution, it would be okay if nobody voted and the state legislatures just decided who the next president is. And the next January 20th situation could be, successful. Um, so Rick is an incredibly sedulous and industrious. I don't know how anyone puts out as much stuff as he does. And I think he may be onto something, that probably would be helpful, a constitutional right to vote, which would guarantee everybody of any ethnicity, race, and so on. I don't know if he has an age. I haven't finished his book yet, but I think I think the book's called A Real Right to Vote, and I think that probably would be helpful. But it requires a constitutional amendment. You have to convince everyone that it's good for them. Um, and it may be that such a right could be connected with things that Republicans have wanted, which is, more careful look at whether this is actually the person who's supposed to be voting, and that would be okay. I think that would be okay with Hassan. It would be okay with me. Uh, but you can't. But on the other hand, attempts to make it more difficult to vote for poor people or people of certain races or whatever would obviously be undone by such a amendment.
What about moving toward what the Australians have done and passed legislation that requires people to vote?
It's an interesting. That's an interesting thought. I've thought about that some compulsory voting. Um, I My first thought was that indifference is indifference. So non-voting provides some information, and so it's not such a it's not wholly good to require people to vote because um, you lose that information and people who don't want to vote. But if you always allow for abstentions, um, then you could require people to vote and and still find out that people don't care.
They'd be
So
willing to pay for to pay a penalty rather than vote.
yeah, and they may be willing to pay a small penalty. I don't think it's a terrible idea. In the past, I think in my book, I say, well, I like the idea of getting that information, but I hadn't thought that you could require abstentions in every. And so um, it might be. it might not be it might not be a bad idea, and I think it's consistent with my views about democracy. Um, uh, I'd like to think about it more. I think the idea of another thing that I thought about recently was requiring people to join a party um, is not such a bad idea either, because it would be, since a lot of people, there are some tremendous number of independents in the U.S., and they would not want to join either the Democratic or the Republican Party. They don't like either of these parties, and so if there were if in order to vote you had to be a member of a party, I think you might see more parties spring up, because I know there's a vast number of people in the U.S. that don't want to be in either of the parties, and that's one of the reasons we have so many independents. So I think those ideas might help, and I want to think more about the compulsory voting question because I think it's an interesting question.
What about at the other end of the results of elections? What if we thought about how we choose our legislators and look back to the Greek experience of selecting our legislators by lottery of some sort? This has occurred to me as an idea that might pull us in the direction of the democracy that you are talking about. You know, we
Well,
would have to have some requirement. My thought was anyone who's willing to serve would take and pass what amounts to a civil service examination to demonstrate competency, knowledge of government, and then their name would go into the lottery. If their name's chosen, they would serve a term in office, and after the end of that term, they would return to their private lives, something like that.
yeah, it's interesting to me how many people are in favor of the lottery system. Um, to me, right now, I think many people don't get who they would like, and what the lottery system says, nobody gets who they would like, and so that you see, I would prefer a government where people got to choose their representatives rather than nobody gets to choose their representative. I wouldn't. It's interesting because you're certainly not alone in liking that method, but to me, it's anti-democratic. It's not people getting what they want. It's people getting some random person to represent them. I think voters should get people who represent their views. And so what the lottery does is says, well, they might, because it's a random, we're going to do it random. It might represent a bunch of people's views. Might not, though. It might be a cuckoo. And it might, and it's to me, I mean, I guess it just depends on what you mean by democracy. To me, that's not a democratic suggestion. It doesn't, it's not in the direction of people getting what they want, of the general will being. Because it's just depending on some probability theory. Well, you might, because it's random, we're going to pick a person at random. It might be your mother-in-law. It could be great for you.
If you don't mind me going a little bit further with that, what
Sure.
if a recall provision was included where 51% of the voters in that geography voted to recall you, even though you were selected by lottery? Then someone else would come in. What occurs to me as the great advantage or plural advantages of a lottery is, number one, you eliminate the need for fundraising, public or private. You eliminate all the campaign activity and the negativity in our campaigns that has been prevalent. Well, I think it's been prevalent almost certainly after George Washington was chosen as president. And thirdly, there's this element that people will serve, will be public servants for a limited period of time, that this is no longer a profession. It's something you do for a limited period of time, and then you go back to your private life. And so the idea of inherited power passing from father to son to grandson, the Kennedy story, for example, or the Bush story. Those kinds of outcomes that exist in our current system would be severely curtailed.
Yeah, that may be the case. I'll tell you what I like about your suggestion, and that's the recall element. I think recall is very democratic. Generally, I think we should have recall. I think every elected official, and perhaps not judges if they're elected in some jurisdictions, ought to be subject to recall. So I'm very much in favor of recall. But you see, recall is I like recall because it's democratic, right? And I like and in fact I don't like even I know people like term limits for the reasons that you mentioned. They don't want the people to stay in. It's hard to get rid of incumbents. But again, that's an undemocratic provision. I think term limits, people should be able to get some guy that's been there for 150 years if they want to. The problems, we'll see what you're doing is you're addressing problems, like the negativity of campaigns, and you're addressing them by some mechanism, because you can't get, because you find yourself unable to, because we find ourselves unable to fix them in a democratic system. So you say, well, we can't fix this. We have these horrible elections. There's all this money being spent. There's negativity in campaigns, and we can't fix this. Or there's people being reelected and reelected and reelected, and they're terrible and they're old and they're but they just keep getting reelected, and we can't fix this. So I know what we'll do. Let's give up on democracy. Let's not have people choose. We'll do it we'll have a machine pick a person. And so we won't have democracy, but we will get rid of all this stuff that we don't like about democracy. I understand that. I agree with you. Those are bad things, but I don't want to give up on democracy. I think it's better to keep trying to have self-government. I don't think a lottery is self-government. It's sort of government by machinery. Again, I certainly understand what the goals are, and I don't want to disagree with you. It might help us get closer to those goals, but I don't think it's an example of democracy.
But I gather you would agree probably with Winston Churchill when he said democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others.
The others, I guess that's it. Yeah, I guess I agree with that, and I think that Britain has a better form than we do. I think parliamentary forms are better. Not that the British form is perfect, but it's much more democratic than ours. And their constitution, such as it is, which is not written, is easier to amend. And I think it's generally a better system. I think parliamentary systems are superior to presidential systems. Not in every way. There are some things I like about presidential systems as well. But I think Churchill, one worse democracy than his own was ours.
Well, I had a question as you were just finishing up, and now it has escaped me. But let me go back to that in a minute if it comes back to me. This is the terrible problem with aging. If you don't you don't capture a thought immediately, sometimes it takes a while for it to come back.
Why am I downstairs again? And who is it that I'm talking
to? Well, in the next to the last chapter of your book, Democratic Theory Naturalized, you join in the debate over claims to rights as inherent to our existence as individuals, or political as essential to our membership in a society. So when I read that, the question came to me, am I correct that you believe societal protections of political rights is of first importance?
Yes, of political rights, but political rights only. Yes, I don't think you can have democracy without that. But remember, that's not all the right. There's no property right there. There's no gun rights. There's no rights to keep people out of your house. What is it? The amendment where you can't be required to house military officials. None of
Right.
that, you know, those are not political rights. But those political rights of speech, equal protection, equal treatment under law, association, assembly, those I think are absolute. If you don't have those, you can't have democracy. Those are of the first importance.
In my teaching here at the Henry George School, and the course that I've taught, getting to the discussion of what constitutes a just society and what constitutes just law, I put this scenario to my students, and it was interesting to get their reaction. I said, what if everyone in this room constitutes all of the members of our society? And one of the issues that really bothers us in our society is double parking. And so we have a vote, and we have a 100% vote in favor of the death penalty for double parking. In democracy, could that be carried out? And what would prevent it from being carried out in a democracy?
I think nothing.
Nothing.
I think if you had nothing would prevent it. I think again, a stupid society is going to produce a stupid government. A cruel society is going to produce a cruel government. It's not fair to democracy to ask it to fix those problems. If you want democracy to fix those problems, you're going to end up with something that isn't democracy. So I think that's a great thought experiment that you give them. And I don't know what they say, but if you can prevent people from enacting a stupid law like that, whether it's a death penalty or what if it's 50 days in jail or whatever it is, if you can prevent people from doing that, what you're saying is, well, I know better than this populace. I really should be king because I know they're too stupid. They can't be allowed to make laws. They just can't be allowed. We have to find someone, whether it's we just designate ourselves or do it by lot, maybe find someone who is better and who knows better, and that I don't. That's a sort of elitism that I don't like. On the other hand, I do think that you might want to ask your students also, well, what about a law that lets us prevent blondes from voting this matter, or that something where something that involves equal treatment, or something where if you have it, you really can't produce a democratic result. And see what they say about that, because I treat those differently. I think there are rights and there are rights. There's no right to there's no right to avoid a death penalty for double parking. I don't think there is such a right, but I do think there is such a right that everybody be treated equally. So if you were only giving this death penalty to certain minorities, then I think you should be able to prevent it.
Well, I think Locke, made in his writings the distinction between liberty and license, behaviors that go beyond our common sense of right and wrong in terms of behavior. And he said those are behaviors that go into the realm of license, where we exercise license to hurt someone else, take someone else's property, in some way violate the liberty of others. And I've always thought that suggests that we are born with some imperfect moral sense of right or wrong, that perhaps this is biologically inherited. I don't know that for sure, but I wonder if our instinct to cooperate comes from this inherited moral sense of right and wrong. And then it's up to our societal relations, our family relations, our community relations, our larger societal relations, to nurture those constructive behaviors.
You may be right, and I hope they get nurtured. I mean, I wouldn't like to live in a really stupid or cruel country. I hope you're right. I don't know that there's been, um, you know, appropriate evolution on that front, but maybe there has. Maybe things are better as a result of this biological trait. As I say, I wouldn't want to live in a cruel democracy, and to some extent, I think I do now. But I don't think, again, I don't think it's democracy's obligation to produce virtue. It's something else, and whether it's a biological trait or maybe it's it's the teacher's problems or the parents' problems. That's where virtue has to come from. You can't expect the setting up of democracy to produce a nice place, because if you do, you're going to end up giving up on democracy.
When we are, when we feel as though our society has failed us in that regard, and we reach the decision to leave, one of the big challenges we have is where to go, where to go to. The frontier is no longer available to us as a safety valve. But does that, it's an impediment, but do we inherently have a right to secede from society? And how do we then exercise that right in the absence of frontier places to go to?
Yeah, I think with people our age, also they don't want us in any place with a health with national health insurance does not want us, because we're just a drain. So we can go to Central America maybe, but we can't go to Finland. They're not going to take you or me, certainly. I mean, that's a good question.
We may have something to offer those societies, even though we're a bit aged.
I think so, but I don't know if they. I think we do. That's a really good question. I talk a little bit in the book about refusing to let people in, and building of walls and so on. And I didn't think much about letting people out if they want to leave. And I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that. I don't know whether it's consistent with democratic principles to prohibit people from leaving altogether, which seems, again, who wants to live in that country where they won't even let you leave? But I don't. Again, it's important to distinguish what makes a bad democracy and what makes a bad country. So I have to think about that more. As to where one could go, I mean, if you're Bezos, I guess the moon, or Musk. For the rest of us, I don't know. I think I'll be 6 feet under before you know it. So that's where I'll be going.
Well, these are really deeply penetrating issues for us to think about. And you've done a lot of thinking, and I think our viewers will benefit by the experience of listening to this conversation. I'd like to leave the last segment of this to you to raise any issues that we haven't covered, important questions that you think we need to consider as we try to move toward a democracy that meets your criteria of a distilled populism.
Well, I think I would encourage people to not just vote, but get involved in electoral activities. I would encourage people to look at various proposals that are out there for approval voting or ranked choice voting or various forms of proportional representation, for elimination of the Electoral College, for any items that will make the country more like a place where the majority is getting what it wants, but minorities, any significant minority, is getting an appropriate voice. And I'm not particularly sanguine about good things happening because of the divisiveness, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, of the current polarism in the country. But I do think that we can try.
Well, those of us who are thoughtful about our condition and want to make the world better for the next generations, we have a lot of challenges, and certainly the form of our governance is an important part of those challenges. And so I thank you for taking the time out to talk to us and for sharing your insights. And I hope that our viewers will find a copy of your book and read it, and maybe get in contact with you to express their own views of, how they think things might be improved.
I'd be happy to hear from them. Thanks a lot for having me.
So thank you very much, Walter. It was great catching up with you. And perhaps as we go through the next electoral cycle, there'll be an opportunity for us to talk again and see whether results suggest to you whether we are moved closer or further away from a real democracy.
Thanks, Ed. Appreciate it.
So, folks, that's it for this edition of Smart Talk. For more information on this and other episodes, please visit our website, henrygeorgeschool.org. Again, I am Edward Dodson, and thank you for watching Smart Talk.